Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Welcome to another episode. I'm Kevin Getz. I'm your number 2 pilot. As always, the navigator to our number 1 pilot. Andy Bryant, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, mate. Like I've said in the past, mate, you're never a number 2.
Hey, just give me a map and I'll get us to the wrong landing zone.
Yeah, there's a joke there somewhere, but I'm not going to repeat it.
Oh, no doubt.
I'm looking forward to this one as ever.
Oh, this is going to be a fantastic episode. I've known our guest, Berend Heitink, going on, 15 years, Jan?
We're definitely going on around 15 years. Yeah.
He's been a wonderful friend. And the reason why we're having him on this podcast, we're actually going to discuss Arnhem, but from an entirely different point of view. And this is very unique because Jan was actually born in Arnhem and spent 10 years in the Netherlands before he moved here to the States. So, an angle probably not too many people really think about. But before we do, as is always our custom, and you are indeed the guest in our virtual pub, Jan, what are you drinking?
I'm actually drinking, it's called Koons. It's a Baltic porter. So it's a product of Poland. And I wanted to tip the hand also to the Polish that were there in Arnhem so many years ago.
Yeah, I'm going with a Smithwick's Red Ale. And Andy, as if I really need to ask,
If I said to you I was drinking an Irish stout, what would you say?
and it starts with a G.
It might, well, yeah, all right, it's Guinness. Okay, moving on, it's Guinness. Bloody hell.
So, gentlemen, cheers.
Cheers.
So before we really get into your experience with Arnhem, I think it's important for our listeners to kind of understand the Dutch experience as to its attempted liberation in September of 1944. Give us some background as to what is transpiring with your family in the spring of 1940.
Spring of 1940, my mother's father, who was actually living in Indonesia, was actually fighting for the Dutch colonial army, or the KNIL, the Koninklijke Nederlandse Indisch Leger, which translates to the Royal Colonial Indonesian Army. He actually was fighting the Japanese. The Japanese were probably, besides the Germans, were the first to use paratroopers, and they invaded the island of Java because of the oil reserves there. And my grandfather, his name was also Jan, was in air defense. And they overwhelmed his position and they captured him, and he was sent off to the Burma line to work. And it's really interesting. My uncle, who's also Army, Dutch Modern Army, about 6 years ago, I believe, the Dutch government released thousands of documents for the Dutch archives. And my uncle found the internment card because just like the Germans, the Japanese were very meticulous in keeping records of all of their POWs, of everything. But he found the internment card, and it was in old Japanese, and then you could still make it out, still made out his name, the date of his internment or capture. So that was really poignant to see that. As growing up in a family that had direct experiences with World War II, my grandfather on my mom's side, he really didn't talk much, as I recalled. And it was until later, as I became a teenager, I was starting to find out a little bit bits and pieces, but more via my uncle or via my dad, because my dad was in the Air Force, modern Air Force. But to get stories, what my grandfather went through in Burma, those were the Japanese were pretty ruthless to their POWs. And of course, my grandfather survived, and he survived because of his Indonesian upbringing or island upbringing, because he knew certain items as they were marching on the Burma line and working on certain food, like roots of certain flowers that they could eat to keep themselves, hydrated or, their nourishment. And he was actually helping some of the Aussies and some of the Brits that he was with to, hey, you need to eat that. Don't eat that because, that's going to cause dysentery. You're going to get sick, all that.
I will say, Jan, this is fascinating stuff.
Yeah. But anyway, in complete contrast, my grandfather on my dad's side, he was born in Bennekom, which literally is about 9 miles from the bridge. So just to kind of give you a perspective with Arnhem. And he actually worked as a electrician, or he knew, he didn't particularly went to trade school, but he knew, to run lines, and come to find out he actually ran telephone lines and also electrical lines for the Dutch Underground. But outside of that, the one story that really stood out, and we're going 1940 when the Germans invaded the Netherlands, the equipment that the Germans had, very modern compared to the Dutch. The Dutch, they were still using World War I armament, and were, of course, overwhelmed very quickly. But the one thing my grandfather, I remembered him telling me this story, and I confronted with my dad because I kind of like, am I getting the timeline correct? Is when the Dutch, the army was starting to prepare. They knew there was going to be a ground invasion, and Arnhem, as to the Hebbeberg, which that's where one of the battles took place, not too far from Arnhem. My grandfather was actually working there, running some lines, electrical lines. And then he said one day they knew they were coming. They knew they were being mobilized. And his supervisor basically said, hey, we're going to start demoing the trees along this main route to blockade the route, so that, and he recalls his supervisor saying, hey, go home, get to safety and everything. And as he wasn't riding his bike actually, because he was just too nervous that he was a target, because my grandfather was really tall. He was actually walking his bike into the village, and behind a hedgerow, a German soldier appeared. And it wasn't until later in life that I really understood, a German soldier appeared. What? Wait a minute. They were already in Holland. How did they get there? So he was stopped. He was startled. And here comes this German soldier behind the hedgerow. I remember him telling me, because he experienced the war a little different than my grandfather that was a POW from the beginning. So he was more, in a sense, romanticizing that part of the war. And luckily he didn't get killed. But he remembers the Edelweiss on the lapel of this soldier. And the soldier, the only thing, the gesture, I remember my grandfather saying that the gesture said with his, basically the silence, putting his finger to his mouth and then move on. So instead of putting a bullet in him, or bringing, of course, awareness, because, the gunshot, that would bring awareness to the location of this soldier. So my grandfather was very lucky, because if it would have been 24 hours later, he probably would have gotten a bullet. But he remembers that being an Edelweiss, and an Edelweiss, come to find out, he was from Austria. And the Austrians, they weren't like your SS. They weren't your, the Austrians were, okay, I hate to use the word sensible or kind in the same word as saying, hey, you're with the German army. Yeah. But thank God he got a pass to go home. So shortly after, the next day, that's when the Germans invaded. And that's when the 4-day standoff, about 4 days, until Holland surrendered.
And how old was your grandfather at this time?
My grandfather was 18. And I actually have a picture of him on the bike, but that was taken after the war. But that was the same bike that that this whole story came about. And it makes my hair stand straight up, because, again, 24 hours later, when the actual invasion happened, he would have probably been captured or killed. But the Germans, when they invaded Holland, Holland as, you are part of us. You are our brothers. You are part of the fatherland. You're very closely related. You do not look different. My grandfather was full-blooded, Dutch. But what happened is because he was 18, young and able, 1941, I think he was actually told to start working in the mines, because he knew, or the Germans found out, because they did interrogate all the youth, the men and everything, and who were capable to work for the fatherland, or how can they contribute. And he was able to contribute through his finesse with his hands and be able to run copper, run whatever. So he worked in the mines. To the story I'm about to tell you now is that my grandfather, going back and forth with the train to the Ruhr area, which is the Ruhr area is, of course, the big industrial complex of Germany at that time, and still is, actually. Very heavy industrial, the mines. And he got weekend passes to come home. And during that summer of 44, there was a lot. The Germans were panicked. They were losing a lot. We had D-Day, so there was already kind of this optimism. And again, I remember my grandfather had all the World War II books. He would watch The Longest Day, been there at the filming when they actually did the principal photography for A Bridge Too Far. He was there in Deventer. He was there. So he, in a sense, again, I hate to use the word that, but romanticized World War II, because he didn't see the true atrocities in that sense. He met my grandmother that summer, and she was actually at a boarding school in Ada. And Ada is another town, a little bit bigger than Bennekom, that is about 11 miles or so from Arnhem. There was a SS training school in Ada, which we come to find out later in how the story unfolds with Operation Market Garden. So my grandfather decided not to go back. There was this time when the Germans were starting to get stricter and they were starting to patrol the streets even with heavier. You could hear more shooting, bombings, things like that. And it partially also the Dutch underground was starting to become more and more aggressive, and the Germans were rounding up anybody that had maybe some affiliation with the Dutch underground and are literally shooting them at the spot. But anyway, my grandfather decided, hey, I'm not going back. I'm fearing for my life because at that time, too, the British were bombing at night. The Americans were bombing during the day in the same mine industrial complex that my grandfather was working. So he was starting to really this is getting intense. And his supervisor was the German supervisor. He said, basically, you see that prisoner there, and I can't remember if it was somebody from Russia or it wasn't Jewish, but it was from the Eastern Front. He said, he's going to be in a world of hurt if you don't come back. He's going to get hurt. They didn't say, well, we're going to kill him. But anyway, my grandfather went in hiding that summer of 44. And luckily, and again, he was quasi-electrician. And he ended up wiring up a little red light, and he ran it down into the kitchen where my great-grandmother was. And when the Germans would be patrolling the streets and you could hear them, she would push a little button and a little light up in the attic, because he was hiding in the attic, would illuminate. And of course, he would be completely quiet, because if he would be picked up because of his background, it would not be good for him. So anyway, luckily he was able to keep himself hidden. My great uncle, so my grandfather's brother, those two collaborated on a lot of things together, and they were so now I'm going to go fast forward to the actual day of September 17th. Him and my great uncle, also Jan, they were actually on a smaller shed, not on top of their house rooftop, but on a shed. And I remember my grandfather telling that when they came over, you couldn't describe it. The noise, the elation, the celebratory spirit, like, here comes the cavalry. We're going to be free of this oppression. We're going to have food, just the elation. And I think perhaps it might be a little bit exaggerated, but I remember him saying he could see the faces of the paratroopers in the doorway. Where Bennekom is it's less than 10 miles from the bridge. So when you look at the landing zones, we were within a minute, not even that, to the landing zones or drop zones. So they said they could actually see their facial expressions. Now, again, I don't know if that's really, because that's way up there.
It certainly encapsulates, though, that elation of the Netherlands was occupied for going on more than 4 years.
Yes. And in the beginning, it was not as aggressive, as belligerent, as like, oh my gosh, these guys are rounding up people and shooting them in the town square and all that. It wasn't like that in the beginning. It was until later that the Germans were starting to round up. And that was mainly because of the Dutch underground, or if they were hiding Jews. And that started happening more so in the bigger cities, because remember, Arnhem is in a very rural area. Arnhem is a big river town in the western part of Holland. It was not like Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam, where a large Jewish population. So you didn't have that as much as in what they call it platteland, which is farmland. Anyway, so they were excited seeing those planes coming over and seeing their liberators coming.
Do they recall the gliders going over us all?
I'm sure they were seeing the gliders, but it was the guys in the little doorways.
Yeah.
Now, a really interesting story, and this is in contrast really to what actually happened. And really, I did not know the enormity of the battle that took place at Westerbouwing. I had no idea as a child the slaughter that happened between both the Brits and the Germans at the Westerbouwing. The Westerbouwing at that time was how would you call it?
It's a theme park.
A theme park. Here you have a theme park on a major battlefield of a story that I don't come to find out until later in life. And my grandfather on my mom's side, he always took me and my sister to the Westerbouwing, but he never would, yeah, as I said, never would talk about what exactly happened there. And he just enjoyed having his grandchildren, and enjoyed that. But my grandfather on my dad's side, I remember when I was a little bit older, he kind of said, hey, there was a heavy fighting at the Westerbouwing. And then again, it wasn't until even just recently when we were there for the 80th, you get this perception of this enormity of what actually all transpired 80 years ago. It's amazing. My grandfather, who experienced literally Operation Market Garden go right over his head, did mention the supply drops. He did mention, I'll never forget this with my great uncle, ended up going where they saw drops coming down, and they had to be very careful because literally you had the German line there. And again, they were 18, 19-year-olds. So you can just imagine adrenaline, let's do it. Let's go. Well, they ended up coming to a canister, and it had one of these little mini bikes, and it was hanging from the tree. But the canister itself was laying on the ground. They opened it. They were so ecstatic. And I remember them all like kind of being boys, teenage, older people. And then all of a sudden, my grandfather says, stop. Do not take that bike. Leave it there because we have to make our way back. If they see us with this British bike, they're going to say, like, where did you get that? And we will be picked up, and it's not going to be good for us.
That's one way of putting it, yeah.
So I'm like going, you didn't pick up the well bike? You should have had the well bike. You know how much a well bike is worth right now? An authentic well bike?
So I'm going to ask you, where were you born?
I was actually born in the Streekziekenhuis, which is actually in Ede. So yeah, because the St. Elizabeth Gasthuis ended up becoming, actually in the 70s, I believe, became into a senior living facility.
Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't a hospital. So anyway, we moved to the States in 78. I recalled A Bridge Too Far because my grandparents, my grandfather, my uncles, they were all talking about, principal photography, everything. So I remember hearing about it, but never seeing the movie. I never saw the movie until it was actually 1979 when it was televised for the first time on CBS. It was a big doo-ha because this movie was just incredible. It had literally every movie star in Hollywood casted for this movie. And it was one of these blockbuster war movies. I do remember my grandfather, believe it or not, he was whistling the tune.
Do you remember what it was like as a kid being in the Netherlands when September rolls around?
Well, as a child, it seems everything is festive. It doesn't seem like a commemoration. It seems more festive because everybody was parked. It was a gathering of a lot. I remember seeing so many British with the red berets because as a child, Holland had some toy manufacturers, but the British had Leslie, had Corby, had Airfix. And I remember always going to the hobby shops and I would see, I got these Airfix. And my favorite toy soldier was the British Airbeam. It is the famous, where there's a captain pointing a certain direction. He has a red beret on. And my dad actually painted those for me, even though the freaking paint flaked off. But I have some of those. And then I have some British Commandos too. But the British were very special to me because I knew as a child I would always see them in the fall. They would come around. And those soldiers have always played, even though I was second generation removed from that, it was something special.
Is that because the generation before, your father and your mother, passed those stories?
Well, it was really
down to you so that you understand that this attempted liberation, this is what this was for.
Well, again, it's my grandmother or my grandfather on my mom's side, of course, who dealt with the Japanese or Indochina. I did not, to be honest with you, I never really got any story firsthand. But my grandfather on my dad's side, who did go into hiding, escaped the war, he actually took me to the battleground.
I was going to ask about what was it like growing up with all that unexploded ordnance?
I remember where there were bombs found or they were on the riverbank, where there were ordinances where the Dutch army, the modern Dutch army at that time, this is again 78, 76, 75 were finding ordnances along the, unexplosive ordnances. And we had to be very careful because as kids, I remember being told, don't start digging anywhere. Don't start digging on the prairie or at the hay, because the hay kind of runs towards Ada, towards Bennekom, that you don't know what you're going to find. And it wasn't I think even in 2019, they were on the hay where they found a body, and they were exhuming a body. And it was the Dutch were very dignified in terms of, the Dutch army were in there. Of course, very possible that particular body had explosive ordnances, in which it did. So they're very careful in doing that, but then also exhuming and then identifying and then bringing that person to, and it still is going on because I think there's still about 100 plus or minus 100. I remember as a kid, we would go to what we call a dump store. Now, I didn't know where the dump came from, but a dump was ex-military, stuff. And I'm talking stuff, uniforms, you name it, helmets, everything. And it was literally pennies to the dollar compared to, what you have now. I remember there was a store on what is the main route into Oosterbeek, Utrechtse West. Yeah. And there was a little store in 2019. It was still there, I believe. And the guy had all kinds of artifacts there, all British, because the German artifacts kind of went somewhere else. But he had all kinds of artifacts. But then, when we came back, he was closed.
Yeah, you make the return to 2019, and I know we will get into the fact that your sister, Deborah, has a house along a very significant route, but you make the return in 2019. We're there with your dad. What is going through your head, your thoughts, as someone who was born in that area? You understand the history and what all the events that had transpired in September of 44. What's going through your head is now you're really immersing yourself with a little bit finer microscope.
Absolutely. And thanks to you and Andy as living historians in making sure the right stories are being told. And there were elements of it that I had no idea, but also elements that kind of reiterated the fact that the Brits and even the Americans down south in Eindhoven and Nijmegen, you guys were shown as liberators. We were about to see the end of the war, see the end of occupation. And I remember one thing that my grandfather did say when they were filming, and he remembers actually when they were actually filming Dares to Glory, because then the whole new movie crew came in, and of course Hollywood, and everything, everybody was in a very jovial mood. They came, but there was still a lot of things there that were just very reminiscent of, because the Germans were ruthless. After the invasion and unfortunate failed attempt to capture the Brewer, the Dutch were moved away from their houses. They, had to be evacuated, and then the hunger. The Germans literally said, "Okay, hey, we're going to cut you off from the food supply." That was, and again, my grandfather on my dad's side, Berend, it was his name, but he went with Ben. Again, he was bartering, so he was able to get, you need some rubber for your tires. He was able to find some rubber, and he was able to get some potatoes, some turnips. But especially after September, I remember him even mentioning that they literally had to find and scourge off the field, find whatever they can, nettles or whatever. They had to boil nettles. They had to, just to get some sort of nutrients in that. And again, I was very juvenile in terms of really understanding that, because my belly was always full. I didn't have I never feared for my life when I was hearing these stories. So it never really impacted until I became older. And then, as I said, the 75th anniversary, when I went with you and really went to the various different battlegrounds as an adult and having an adult understanding of what all happened, it was just like, wow. And gave me a full appreciation of why the Dutch citizens at that time, the Dutch inhabitants of Arnhem and the surrounding Arnhem, Oosterbeek and Ada and Bennekom, were so wanting to embrace the liberator and did whatever they could they'd be in hiding. Because don't forget, I mean, there were over several hundred British soldiers that went into hiding after the 26th of September. And if you were caught with a British soldier, I mean, you would be taken out. So the risk that they took, but then just afterward, seeing what happened. Now, some of these, and not where my grandfather was living at that time, because in Bennekom, but when you get closer and closer to where the battlegrounds, where soldiers actually fell, where they died, and they were buried in literally one's backyard, their house backyard. And then the children, who would be now, either my grandparents or be my parents, but the flowers that they would put on their graves in their backyard, and that they would water those flowers. That tradition started the laying of the flowers. That when they finally able to take the bodies and exhume the body and move them to the Oosterbeek cemetery, they wanted to make sure that they kept honoring those young soldiers as children to lay those flowers. That's where the laying of the flowers every year. And then my niece and my nephew, my sister's kids, every year. Now, I think it starts, in fourth, would be equivalent like fourth grade, if I'm not mistaken. So they have an understanding. Why am I laying these flowers at this tombstone of a soldier, and then the name? So they actually try to find out who that person was at 18 or 19 or 17 or 22 or 23. I mean, I have children that age, and it just blows me away what they did for the greater cause, to fight true evil in this world, what they gave up. And that right there should never, ever be forgotten. And that's the Dutch determination, the Dutch people determination to never, ever forget the sacrifice of those soldiers, that they went up the mountain. They tried, through every degree of difficulty to end the war. They set the tone. And then luckily, 6 months later, Holland was liberated.
We know your sister. She has a house along Lion Route, which our listeners will know that is the river road for Tupera. When you're visiting her and you step out that door and you go down the steps,
the cobblestones,
what's it like as somebody from the Netherlands, knowing that 30 feet from her door, you are standing on history?
It's almost like for those that have been to various battle sites, and I will just take a famous battle here in the United States. You take Gettysburg, and you go to like Devil's Den, and you go to Little Round Top, and you stand there, and it makes your hair stand straight up, because you know something very significant happened there. Significant in terms of if it was a push to get to the bridge, if it was a push to move your line, your perimeter line, and to whatever sacrifice that meant for the boys. It is poignant. Every time when I'm there, I look and it's like, this narrow road, really? And just imagine the columns that have to like move through there, and it's daunting, really. And then luckily my sister's house did get damaged, but not as damaged as some of the other houses in that area, because you're looking at Lower Oosterbeek and like Weverstraat and all that. I mean, those houses were demolished, and you can actually see some survived. So you can see some of the facades that they were able to keep. That's a lot of you on all new builds, in there. And but my sister's house is one of the houses that survived, even though the roof collapsed. And then she, I remember she asked me, "Hey, can you get those suitcases from the attic?" And I remember going up in the attic and then looking actually at the chimney. And my sister did say already, "Hey, just look at the chimney." Didn't say what I'm going to find or whatever. And then I saw the chimney and literally saw the impacts where the shrapnel, hit. And I was like, geez, this is right here,
What can I say? I mean, I've hardly said anything in this episode, but that's purely because I've been hanging on every word you've been saying pretty much, Jan. Before we do wrap up, is there anything else that you might want to add?
Well, I have a lot of respect for you guys, for you, Kevin, for Andy, that keep history alive. Because if it wasn't without you guys, we only would get a museum, very two-dimensional aspect of history. You guys give us a three-dimensional, just a glimpse at what it would have been like, and then being able to really understand what happened. And the respect I have for the British and for what they've done, and also the Dutch, the people that were in the battle itself and trying to help in every way they could, so the liberators could be successful. That is what I got out of all this. And as I'm maturing more, in my understanding what has happened, my hair stands straight up. I mean, it just,
I said it on one of our previous episodes. I have been to Normandy many a time, and I love it there, and we're always warmly welcomed. But going to Arnhem for the 80th last year was like going home. We were so welcomed as Brits, and we were just living history. We weren't ex-paras or whatever, and it was amazing to walk around that town, and every other house seems to have a Pegasus hanging from the window. It was something, and I'm eternally grateful for the remembrance that the Dutch people have for Arnhem, the Battle of Arnhem. Yeah, brilliant.
absolutely.
It's
we're getting the stink eye.
It's that time again, I'm afraid, gentlemen, where we have to draw proceedings to a close.
Jan, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to kind of give our listeners perspective of Arnhem they may not necessarily consider, because it's not about B Company did this or Two Para did that or the Air Landing Brigade was here. But I think it's a story nonetheless that needs to be told with regards to the Dutch and what the role that they had to play in September of 44.
Thank you ever so much, Jan. And we'll always have that midnight stroll down to the river, all of us.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, we will, won't we?
I tell you, that was,
Yeah.
I'll
wait till we're off air.
Yes,
Absolutely.
lest we forget.
So I think, gentlemen, on that note, I think, as Kevin said, the landlord has been giving us the eye for the last 5-10 minutes. I think it's time to say thank you ever so much again, Jan, for coming on. Thank you to our listeners. Don't forget to give us a like, a follow, a subscribe, and a comment wherever you listen to us. You'll hear us again on the next one, but in the meantime, it just remains for me to say time, gentlemen, please, on another episode of Ham and Jam. Gentlemen, raise your glasses. Cheers.
Cheers. And
Ham and
Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Well, hello, Andy, Brian. Our listeners are going to know where you were born.
Bloody hell.